Yesterday, we touched on many things just as an introduction. Today, we'll actually read the pasuk inside. V'yedaber Hashem Moshe Lemor, Shlach l'cho anoshim. The Torah could have said Shlach anoshim if the request was to send scouts to scout out the land. It could have said send. Hashem permits it. What's Shlach l'cho? You should send on your behalf men, V'yosur Eretz Canaan, and they should scout out the land of Canaan, Asher ani nosen l'bnei Yisrael, which I am giving to the Bnei Yisrael. Again, the Rechaim HaKodesh makes it a point. It could have just said V'yosur Eretz Canaan. Seemingly, that I am giving to Bnei Yisrael is totally superfluous. We know the land of Canaan is the promised land, going back to Avram Avinu, to Yitzchak, to Yaakov. It is yours and it's your progeny after you. So what does the Torah have to mention in this context that I am giving to the Jewish people? Ish echod, lamate avosov tishlochu. Each person representing his tribe, of his paternal lineage, you should send kol nosibem. And each of them should be a prince, the prince of each one of these tribes. Let's see Rashi. Shlach l'cha anoshim. You should send for yourself anoshim. Loma nischum parshas meraglim, the parshas Miriam. What is to juxtapose the portion of the spies, the portion of Miriam where she became a leper for speaking out of turn about Moshe Rabbeinu? Vishalokso al iske dibo shedibro bo'achio, because she was smitten due to something regarding her speech, because she had spoken critically of a brother. Rishoim halolu, and these evil people, rovelo kol musar. They saw, and they didn't take any musar. Musar always means the takeaway should have been something which should have controlled them, should have given them an understanding of the consequences of speaking out of turn. But these Rishoyim, they saw what happened to Miriam, and they did not make the takeaway, learn the lesson. That's what the Torah juxtaposes this to the incident of Miriam. As we're going to explain, it's very interesting. I'm factually, I just thought of at this moment, that what would have been the lesson if they would have learned it well from Miriam? Miriam originally had heard that Moshe had separated from his wife. And when she heard this, she was slightly taken aback because she felt this was seemingly a valid criticism of Moshe Rabbeinu. Because Aaron and Miriam were prophets, and they continued their relationships with their spouses. Although God communicated with them, they didn't separate. So why did Moshe Rabbeinu separate from his wife and not continue having that conjugal relationship with his wife? So that was the basis for the criticism. So Hashem says to Miriam, don't you realize you spoke Moshe Avdi? You spoke critically of Moshe firstly. In addition, he's Avdi, he's my servant. And in addition, he's Moshe Avdi, he's a combination of both, compoundedly, meaning, firstly, he's Moshe, or Avdi, firstly, he's my servant. So if he's my servant, he's dedicated to that degree. There's nothing he does without my endorsement. So evidently, his behavior is appropriate. You may not understand, but if you would have understood who Avdi is, you wouldn't have spoken critically of him. In addition, he's Moshe. Being Moshe, also again, and if I have a relationship with him, evidently, I only have the relationship with him because he hasn't fallen short of who he's supposed to be. So if she would have stopped to think and understood who Moshe was, she would have understood not to speak critically of him. There was no basis for the criticism. You may not understand, but there's no basis for criticism. Identically, you come to the promised land and you see many things there. and what you see and what you witness are things which are contradictory and contrary to what God promises. It's a land of blessing, flows with milk and honey, only good things, and wherever you turn, people are burying their dead. It's a land of giants. Seemingly, it's a contradiction for what God told us. And Moshe being God's representative, what he communicated to us. So what was the takeaway? The takeaway was based on their superficial understanding of what they saw. Therefore, the conclusion was God is taking us to destroy us. But if you understand who God is, that God doesn't renege on his word, you would have seen it correctly. The 10 would have seen it as Yoshua and Kalev. It would have been a whole different interpretation. Or you would have left it to pass judgment, not to conclude it's a death trap. So because they did not learn the lesson as they should have learned the lesson, therefore they spoke critically of Hashem against the land, they slandered the land, they slandered God, and the conclusion was, this is a ploy to destroy us. Okay? Now, we had said, why did Yoshua and Kalev see it one way? The same script. They read the script one way, and the Meraglim had read the script differently. So we had said was that if you have trust in a person, or you trust in God, implicit trust, as Yoshua and Kalev had, now you see this, you know and understand it's impossible to be as it seems to be. There's only one answer, as Kalev and Yoshua saw it. We have to scout out the land. We have to go unhindered, not to feel in any way at any moment threatened. So God brings endless tragedies on all the people of Canaan. They should be immersed in their grief. And as a result of this, they don't notice us when we scout out the land. That's why people are dying. Because there's no other understanding other than, as Yoshua and Kalev understood it. Why? Because if God said it's a land that flows with milk and honey, and it's a land that's filled with only good, how do you understand this? There's only one way to understand it, as Kalev and Yoshua understood it, which was correct. The Meraglim, who were lacking in faith and did not trust God, the interpretation of Kalev and Yoshua was not a plausible interpretation. As a result of that, they said, this is a confirmation of what we believed all along. All along, that this is only a ploy to mislead us, to convince us that this is the ultimate, but ultimately, he will destroy us. That was the difference between Kalev and Yoshua. Did they have trust? Did they not have trust? But factually, if you don't trust God, this has nothing to do with Miriam. Miriam, she did not read the script right. If she would have appreciated who Avdi was, who Moshe was, and God has a relationship, it is impossible that he did something wrong. But if you don't trust God, this has nothing to do with Miriam. What's the takeaway? What is the takeaway? Seems to be they're not comparable. Miriam's basis for her misreading, and Dev's misreading is a total different misreading. With Miriam, she jumped the gun. She did not stop to think and understand why Moshe's behavior is not as they see it. Because if he's Avdi's Moshe and God has that relationship, that clearly means he's doing the right thing. His decision was only because God allowed him to do what he's doing. Here, if you don't trust God, you read the script as they read it. So what lesson could have they learned from Miriam? Simply, they're not comparable. So I think the answer is that as much as you don't trust God, but factually, if you heard the reading of Kalev and Yoshua, and it is a plausible reading, why don't you hold judgment before you pass judgment? The answer is because the way we seem to see it, that's the way it is. But seemingly, if they would have seen it and would have given any consideration to the scenario as Yeshua saw it and Kalev saw it, they wouldn't come to that conclusion. You know, if you have two readings of something, one person reads it one way, another person reads the script differently, and you understand that the other person's reading for the script is a plausible understanding, you'd say, you know something, we'll hold judgment in a bay, we'll wait to see. But they didn't do that. They came to a conclusion, definitely a death trap. How do you jump the gun? How do you come to such a conclusion? Don't you realize the consequences? That if you're wrong, how serious those consequences, as you see by Miriam. Miriam, as the Ramban writes, she was a tzadekis. She was a prophetess. She put her life in jeopardy when Moshe was put into the Nile. She loved her brother. But because she spoke out of turn, look at God's reaction. So us, which were not at that level, don't you think God's going to react? So why did they stop and wait? We have, even though they were lacking in faith, but you realize Yeshua and Kalev's reading is definitely a plausible reading of the reality. So why don't you just hold judgment in the abeyance and see what happens? No, they concluded. They did not give God the time of day. And they jumped the gun, and therefore that was the conclusion, and therefore that's where they failed. So Rishon Halolu, because they were Shoim, and they concluded they don't trust God, therefore they did not read the script. And they never gave consideration to Yeshua and Kalev's reading of that reality, or consideration for what they were saying has any basis of truth.